You ever notice how the wealthiest people in the world rarely talk about the rules they actually live by? They'll give interviews, they'll speak at conferences, they'll drop a few harmless nuggets of advice, but the real operating system they run their lives on, that stays behind closed doors. So today, I'm pulling back that curtain. I'm sharing the 7 quiet rules, never formally announced, never printed in a book that every billionaire I've observed follows instinctively, even if they never say it out loud. When people imagine billionaires, they tend to picture boardrooms, private jets, and aggressive business decisions splashed across news headlines. What they rarely consider are the quiet forces behind the scenes, the unspoken principles these individuals operate by every single day. These aren't the kind of rules you find in self-help books or motivational speeches, because the wealthiest people on the planet almost never talk about them directly. Not because they're hiding some secret formula, but because these principles have become so deeply ingrained in their thinking that they barely even notice them anymore. They don't discuss them, they just live them. And that's exactly why most people never see them. The rules billionaires follow are subtle, often counterintuitive, and woven into the fabric of how they think, not what they say. When you strip away the headlines and the myths, you start to realize their real advantages don't come from smarter ideas or luck. They come from mental models and habits that run silently in the background of their daily lives. One of the biggest misconceptions is that billionaires simply inherit a lucky mindset or stumble into the right opportunities. But the truth is far more interesting. They cultivate a very specific way of approaching decisions, risk, relationships, and time. Most people operate with a reactive mindset, responding to circumstances as they appear. Billionaires, on the other hand, operate with an internal compass. They don't wait for guidance from the outside world because they rely on rules they've developed through experience, observation, and a deep understanding of how systems work. But again, these rules aren't something they step on stage and announce. They're often so personal and internalized that if you ask them to list their guiding principles, they might struggle to articulate them. Not because they don't exist, but because they've been practiced for so long, they've become instinct. Another reason these rules rarely get talked about is the nature of public perception. The ultra-wealthy are acutely aware that anything they say publicly can be judged, misunderstood, or turned into a headline. So they tend to stick to generic, safe advice like follow your passion or work hard. Meanwhile, the nuanced principles they actually rely on stay behind the scenes. They might talk about mindset, but they won't spell out the quiet calculations they make before entering a partnership, the way they evaluate a person's character within minutes, or the internal filters they use to separate real opportunities from noise. These are the kinds of rules that can't really be packaged into a quote or a slogan. They're subtler than that, and honestly, most people wouldn't believe them even if they were said out loud. Another layer to this is that billionaires usually operate in environments where understanding unspoken rules is a prerequisite. Their circles are built on trust, reputation, and long-term behavior. In those environments, the rules don't need to be stated, they're understood through action. For example, protecting your time at all costs isn't something they sit down and teach each other, it's just something everyone does. Thinking 10 or 20 years ahead isn't a public talking point, it's simply the default lens they make decisions through. It's like an unspoken cultural code, the kind of thing you learn through proximity rather than instruction. And yet, for the everyday person looking from the outside, it's precisely these invisible rules that create the largest gap. People hear the public advice but don't see the private patterns. They hear the interviews but miss the mindset. They see the results but not the quiet disciplines that built them. When you start paying attention to how these individuals move, how they think, and how they filter the world, you realize they're playing a different game, not a louder one, a quieter one. A game where the real rules aren't broadcasted, because the people who follow them don't need to talk about them. They live them, breathe them, and act on them without ever labeling them as anything special. And that's exactly why so few people ever recognize the patterns that shape their success. Most people grow up believing that the wealthy are obsessed with money, counting it, chasing it, stacking it. But if you spend any time studying how the ultra-wealthy think, you quickly realize something surprising. Money is almost never the thing they obsess over. In fact, money is the byproduct, not the focus. What they're truly obsessed with is leverage. They look at money the same way an engineer looks at a tool, useful, powerful, important, but ultimately just one type of instrument among many. What really moves the needle in their world is anything that multiplies their effort without multiplying their workload. That's leverage. And once you start viewing the world through that lens, everything changes. Most people stay stuck in a linear mindset. They trade an hour of work for an hour of pay. They solve problems one by one. They think in terms of effort and reward, as if the two must always match. Billionaires don't think this way. They put their energy into things that scale. They ask different questions instead of how much will I make if I do this. They're asking, how many times will this pay me? Or how much will this grow while I'm not touching it? They focus less on being the hardest worker and more on building systems, tools, knowledge, or teams that continue working even when they're asleep, traveling, or thinking about something entirely different. That's leverage in its simplest form, doing the work once, getting the result over and over. But leverage isn't just about technology or capital. It's about strategy. The wealthy treat their decisions like multipliers. Every choice is weighed not for the immediate reward, but for the potential compounding effect. A conversation today might turn into a partnership next year, which becomes a billion-dollar idea a decade later. A habit formed today might give them sharper thinking for the rest of their life. A small investment in learning a new skill today could unlock opportunities they never even knew existed. They seek leverage in places most people don't even bother to look because they're not evaluating their lives through a multiplier lens. One of the most overlooked forms of leverage they use is people. Billionaires don't try to be great at everything. They don't carry every responsibility on their shoulders. They surround themselves with individuals whose strengths compensate for their weaknesses. They delegate with precision, not because they're avoiding work, but because they understand that one person, even a brilliant one, is always limited. But a coordinated network of skilled, motivated people, that's limitless leverage. They invest time in finding great talent, nurturing relationships, and creating environments where other people can perform at their best. They know that the right person in the right role can create returns far greater than any single individual working alone. Another area they find leverage in is knowledge. Not the kind you memorize for a test, but the kind that permanently shifts how you see the world. They spend enormous amounts of time learning, not because they're trying to check boxes, but because they understand that one insight can permanently increase the value of every decision they make afterward. That's leverage on a mental level. A new framework, a new perspective, a new strategy is something that pays dividends for a lifetime. Meanwhile, most people stop learning the moment school ends and wonder why their opportunities stop growing too. And perhaps the most misunderstood type of leverage is the quietest one: processes. Billionaires love building systems that remove unnecessary decisions and create consistent results. They automate what can be automated. They streamline what can be simplified. They build routines and habits that free up mental bandwidth so they can focus their mind on high-impact work. They know that small inefficiencies compound just as quickly as wealth does. A system that saves 10 minutes a day becomes hours every month and entire weeks every year. They understand that a well-designed process is one of the most powerful forms of leverage because once it's built, it reduces friction forever. When you step back and look at how billionaires operate, you realize that the reason they achieve so much isn't because they're superhuman. It's because they avoid playing the linear game everyone else gets trapped in. They move differently. They think in terms of multipliers, not moments. They value the things that expand their impact instead of the things that drain their energy. And by doing that consistently, they position themselves in a world where growth is no longer tied to effort, but to strategy, alignment, and scale. If there's one thing that separates billionaires from the rest of the world in a way almost nobody talks about, it's how they handle their emotions. People love to imagine that the wealthiest individuals are simply gifted, with some extraordinary intellect or access to special information. But surprisingly, it's their emotional discipline, the ability to stay steady while everything around them is shaking, that gives them a massive edge. Most people react. They hear bad news and panic. They see a sudden market drop and make impulsive decisions. They get criticized and become defensive. They hit obstacles and start doubting themselves. Billionaires don't operate like that. They've trained themselves to recognize that emotional volatility is the fastest way to destroy long-term progress, and calm thinking is the fastest way to create it. When something unexpected happens, the average person's instinct is to move quickly, almost aggressively, as if speed is always the answer. But the ultra-wealthy know that speed without clarity is just chaos in disguise. They slow things down, they zoom out, they look at the bigger picture instead of the immediate discomfort. When others are losing their minds, they're asking questions: what exactly is happening here? What information do I need? What's the right decision, not the easy one? They don't get swept up in the emotional weather of the moment because they understand that decisions made in fear or excitement are usually the most expensive ones. This emotional stillness isn't a personality trait, it's a practice skill. What makes this interesting is that billionaires rarely talk about this calmness publicly because it sounds too simple, too ordinary, almost too human. They'll talk about strategy, innovation, vision, but they won't go on stage and say, my advantage is that I don't freak out. Yet, if you study their decisions, interviews, and crisis moments, that's exactly what you'll see. Whether the market is crashing, a major deal is falling apart, or the media is stirring chaos, their tone barely changes. They operate from a place of internal balance rather than external noise. It's not that they don't feel stress, they do. They just don't let it dictate their behavior. And in a world where everyone is reacting emotionally, the person who remains composed automatically rises to the top. There's also something powerful about how billionaires handle uncertainty. Most people crave certainty and become anxious without it. But the ultra-wealthy view uncertainty as a constant, not a crisis. They expect it, they plan for it, they train themselves to operate effectively within it. This emotional adaptability allows them to make rational decisions even when the situation is unclear or evolving. They don't rush to conclusions. They don't cling to comforting falsehoods. They don't distort reality to feel better. They accept uncertainty fully and respond to it with clarity instead of fear. That's one of the reasons why they can spot opportunities in situations where others only see danger. Another aspect of their emotional strength is that they don't take setbacks personally. When an idea fails, they don't collapse into self-blame or embarrassment. They treat failure like data, not identity. They look at the outcome, extract the lesson, and move forward with the same steadiness they had before. They understand that emotions like shame, disappointment, and frustration are natural, but they don't let those emotions linger long enough to interfere with their progress. This ability to process emotions quickly and cleanly saves them enormous amounts of time and mental energy. It keeps them from getting stuck in cycles of hesitation or regret that derail so many people. Even in interpersonal situations, their emotional control plays a massive role. Negotiations, partnerships, hiring decisions, these all require a steady mind. If you're easily offended, triggered, pressured, or manipulated, you're easy to outmaneuver. Billionaires understand this intuitively. They listen more than they speak. They observe extremely closely. They respond deliberately. Their calmness becomes a form of power because calm people make others feel unsettled when they can't read them. That imbalance often shifts conversations, deals, and outcomes in their favor without them forcing anything. In the end, emotional stability isn't something the ultra-wealthy acquired after becoming successful. It's part of what made them successful in the first place. Clarity beats chaos. Composure beats reactivity. Long-term vision beats short-term panic. And those who master their emotions eventually master their decisions, their opportunities, and their future. If there's one trait that quietly powers almost every breakthrough, every fortune, and every unexpected leap the ultra-wealthy make, it's their relationship with curiosity. Not the casual kind of curiosity most people have, the type where you Google something interesting, read about it for 5 minutes, and then move on. Billionaires operate with a different level of curiosity entirely, almost an aggressive form of it. It's a hunger to understand how things actually work beneath the surface, a refusal to accept simple answers, and a relentless need to keep pulling on threads until the entire underlying structure of a concept becomes clear to them. It's not just intellectual interest, it's intellectual pursuit. Most people look for information. Billionaires look for understanding. There's a huge difference between the two. Information fills your mind, understanding transforms it. Information tells you what something is. Understanding tells you why it is the way it is. That distinction is where their curiosity lives. They don't just want to know the facts, they want to know the mechanics. If they're studying markets, they don't stop at trends, they look at the forces that create those trends. If they're analyzing an industry, they don't just learn who the competitors are, they learn why the industry formed in the first place and what invisible pressures shape its future. Their curiosity is deep, structural, and far-reaching. This kind of curiosity shows up early in their lives, long before they have money. Many of them were the kids taking apart radios just to see how the pieces fit together, the teenagers reading books way outside their school curriculum, the adults experimenting with business ideas simply to understand what would happen. Even later in life, after achieving wealth, they continue learning with the same intensity. Their curiosity never switches off. It becomes a permanent operating mode, one that keeps them evolving while others plateau. One thing that makes their curiosity so different is how they respond to unfamiliar subjects. Most people feel discomfort when confronted with something they don't understand. Billionaires feel attraction. They lean into complexity instead of backing away from it. If something seems too confusing or too technical, that's exactly what draws them in. They have an instinct to decode it, to figure out the patterns, to see what everyone else is missing. Their curiosity is almost like a spotlight that automatically moves toward anything unclear or misunderstood. They know that hidden inside complexity is opportunity, and the people willing to untangle a knot often find something valuable at the center. Another powerful aspect of their curiosity is that they don't limit it to their own industry. They explore everything: science, psychology, design, history, philosophy, technology, politics, human behavior, systems thinking. They understand that breakthrough ideas often come from connecting dots across unrelated fields. They're not just curious about what benefits them directly. They're curious because curiosity expands the mind. And an expanded mind sees what an average mind overlooks. They collect frameworks, mental models, and patterns from every discipline they encounter. Over time, this creates a rich internal database that helps them spot connections others can't see. And here's the interesting part. Their curiosity is usually quiet, not performative, not loud, not something they showcase. You won't always see them in debates or talking endlessly about what they've learned. Their curiosity is private and inward. It shows up in how they ask questions, how they observe, how carefully they listen. They pay attention in a way that's almost surgical. They don't just hear what someone is saying, they search for the meaning behind it. They don't just look at a situation, they examine the forces behind it. Their curiosity is both a magnifying glass and an X-ray. It lets them zoom in on the smallest detail and also see through the surface to the deeper structure. They're also curious about people, not just in the sense of being interested in personalities, but in understanding motivations, fears, strengths, and patterns in human behavior. They study how people think, how they make decisions, how they respond to incentives, how they react under pressure. They know that understanding people is one of the highest forms of leverage because business, negotiation, leadership, and influence all come down to reading human nature accurately. Their curiosity gives them insight into character, reliability, ambition, and potential long before those traits reveal themselves on the surface. Their curiosity often leads them to ask simple questions, but in a deeper way than most. They're not afraid to question assumptions or challenge the status quo. They don't accept that's just how it's done as an answer. They dig until they find the root. This constant questioning is what helps them identify inefficiencies, spot emerging trends, and create opportunities others are blind to. Curiosity is the engine behind their innovation. It's the spark that lights ideas that eventually grow into billion-dollar realities. Another thing people misunderstand is that curiosity requires humility. You can't be intensely curious if you think you already know everything. Billionaires, despite their success, are usually the first to admit what they don't know. They approach learning with the mindset of a beginner, not an expert. They're willing to look ignorant temporarily if it means becoming knowledgeable permanently. That humility paired with curiosity becomes a superpower because it keeps their minds open long after most people have closed theirs. And perhaps the most transformative part of their curiosity is how it shapes their identity. When you live with that level of curiosity, you're constantly evolving. You're not stuck with old beliefs. You don't cling to outdated assumptions. You follow your curiosity wherever it leads, and in doing so, you continually upgrade how you think and who you are. This long-term evolution fueled by curiosity is one of the reasons billionaires stay ahead. They're not just accumulating wealth, they're accumulating wisdom, perspective, and mental range. And over time, that makes all the difference. One of the most overlooked differences between the way billionaires think and the way most people think is the timeline they operate on. Most people make decisions based on what feels good this week or what might pay off next month. They want fast results, quick wins, immediate feedback. But billionaires almost never operate on that kind of timeline. Their minds are stretched over years, sometimes decades. What they choose to do today is rarely about today. It's about what they believe will matter 10, 15, even 20 years from now. That long horizon is one of the most powerful advantages they have, and it's not because they magically wake up thinking like that, it's because they've trained themselves to look beyond the moment and anchor their decisions to a future version of themselves. When your time horizon expands, everything changes. Small setbacks stop feeling like disasters because you're not living in a world where the next 30 days define your life. You stop chasing every shiny opportunity because you realize most of them won't matter 5 years down the line. You become far more intentional with what you build, what you commit to, and who you surround yourself with because you understand that consistency compounds far more than intensity. Billionaires get this at a deep level. They know that the real breakthroughs, the real transformations, the real wealth, financial or otherwise, come from long-term alignment, not short-term excitement. One of the reasons they rarely talk about this publicly is because it sounds almost boring in a world obsessed with overnight success. People want fast paths, shortcuts, hacks, secret doors. Billionaires know that almost none of that is real. They build in seasons, they plan in layers, they think of their life as a long construction project where each decision is another beam being welded into place. When you think in decades, you stop rushing, you stop panicking, you stop comparing yourself to people who hit a quick win. You understand that one good year doesn't make you and one bad year doesn't break you. That mindset alone creates a level of stability most people never experience. This long-term thinking also shows up in how they treat relationships. While most people approach connections transactionally, what can this person do for me right now? Billionaires invest in relationships that may not pay off for years, if ever. They build trust slowly, consistently, through repeated positive interactions. They follow up, they show up, they remember details, they offer value with no immediate expectation, and because they play such a long game, their network becomes incredibly strong over time. A person they connected with a decade ago might become a partner in a massive deal today. A quiet relationship they've maintained for years might be the key that opens a door they didn't even know they'd need. That's the power of thinking beyond the moment. They also apply this philosophy to reputation. Instead of worrying about short-term image or how people react to a single decision, they think about their overall arc. They care about being trusted over a lifetime, not about being liked on a particular day. They're willing to make unpopular decisions if those decisions align with their bigger vision. They're willing to wait for the world to understand them later instead of trying to be understood immediately. That patience builds an internal confidence that becomes one of their greatest assets. Even in business, the long view is everything. When a billionaire invests in a company, launches a project, or develops a new idea, they aren't asking, how can I get this to pay me fast? They're asking, if this works the way I believe it can, what will it become in a decade? That's why they're not easily shaken by early losses or slow starts. They expect the beginning to be difficult. They expect the path to wobble. They're not looking for a perfect straight line. They're looking for the right direction. When you think long term, momentum matters more than speed. And perhaps the most powerful part of this long-term mindset is how it shapes their identity. They behave today according to who they want to be years from now. Their routines reflect their future self. Their habits reflect their future goals. Their decisions reflect their future vision. Most people try to change their life without changing their timeline. Billionaires change their timeline, and everything else shifts with it. If there's one pattern that repeats itself over and over in the lives of the ultra-wealthy, it's that they understand the value of people long before they ever need anything from them. Most people think networking is something you do when you're looking for an opportunity, when you're trying to get your foot in the door, or when you suddenly realize you're missing connections. But billionaires don't wait for the moment of need. They build relationships proactively, patiently, and consistently. Like gardeners planting seeds in a field they know they'll return to years later. Their networks aren't accidental, they aren't rushed, and they definitely aren't transactional. They're the result of years, sometimes decades, of nurturing, staying in touch, being present, offering value, and respecting the long arc of human connection. What makes their approach different is that they never treat relationships as tools. They treat them as ecosystems. They understand that when someone feels seen, respected, and valued without being asked for anything, the bond becomes exponentially stronger. Most people only reach out when they want something, and that immediately sets the tone for the interaction. But when you invest in people with no agenda, they remember you. They feel the difference. And over time, these small, genuine touches accumulate into something incredibly powerful. Billionaires know this intuitively. They build trust before they need trust. They build goodwill before they need support. They create positive memories before they ask for collaboration. By the time they actually need a door to open, the foundation is already there. Another thing the ultra-wealthy understand is that your network is not about how many people you know, it's about the quality and depth of the connections you maintain. They don't chase volume, they chase alignment. They look for people who operate with integrity, who think long-term, who solve problems rather than create them, who are emotionally stable, and who have a history of following through. Because when you're building something meaningful, you don't need a crowd. You need a handful of people you can rely on with absolute confidence. So instead of scattering their attention across hundreds of superficial connections, they go deep with the ones that matter. They know that one strong relationship can create opportunities that 100 weak ones never could. This long-term mindset also shows up in how they communicate. They're not the type to disappear for years and suddenly reappear asking for favors. Even if they're busy, and they usually are, they make small, consistent efforts to stay in touch. A quick message of congratulations, a thoughtful question, a recommended article, a short check-in. They understand that relationships are maintained through tiny moments, not grand gestures. And because they build this habit into their lives, their networks never feel abandoned or forgotten. Everyone in their circle feels connected to them, even if interactions are brief. That consistency keeps relationships warm, and warm relationships are the ones that lead to the most valuable collaborations. Another quiet principle they follow is that they never underestimate anyone. The intern today might be the CEO in 10 years. The entry-level employee might become the founder of a major company. The quiet, introverted engineer might end up building world-changing technology. Billionaires keep their minds open to the potential in people. They understand that life moves in unpredictable ways, and the person with little influence today might be the one who changes everything later. Because of this, they treat everyone with genuine respect. They're not selectively kind. They're universally attentive. People notice that. It's one of the reasons their networks stay loyal. They are also extremely intentional about the environments they place themselves in. They know that proximity matters. Being around curious, ambitious, long-term thinkers shapes your own thinking. They gravitate toward rooms where ideas are alive and people are pushing boundaries. And once they're in those rooms, they don't try to dominate the space. They listen, they observe, they learn, they ask questions, they show interest. That humility creates connection. People want to be around someone who seeks to understand rather than impress. Another part of their networking philosophy is that they give value first. Not money necessarily, value. Insight, encouragement, introductions, thoughtful feedback, useful resources. They look for ways to make someone's life easier or better without expecting anything in return. This is where most people misunderstand networking. They try to take first. Billionaires give first. And the strange thing is, the less you try to take, the more people end up wanting to give you. It's a natural human response. People remember who helped them when there was nothing to gain. They remember who believed in them early. They remember who showed up when nobody else did. These are the relationships that last decades. What's also unique is how patient they are with relationships. They don't force connections. They don't rush trust. They don't expect instant chemistry. They let relationships evolve organically. If someone isn't ready for a partnership now, that's fine. Maybe they will be in 5 years. If a collaboration isn't possible today, they don't close the door forever. They keep the line warm. They know that timing is often the invisible factor behind every major opportunity. They're willing to wait. In the end, billionaires follow a simple truth that most people overlook. Relationships compound, just like investments. The connection you build today might grow into something extraordinary years from now. A single relationship, tended over time, can become a bridge to opportunities that you could never create on your own. They understand this deeply, and because they live by it, they move through the world-building networks that quietly shape their future long before the future arrives. If there's one trait that often hides in plain sight among the ultra-wealthy, it's their obsession with simplicity. Not the superficial kind of simplicity that comes from cutting corners or avoiding complexity, but a deep, disciplined commitment to stripping away anything unnecessary so they can focus on what truly matters. Most people assume that billionaires live in a world full of complicated ideas, intricate strategies, and layers upon layers of planning. And yes, some of their ventures can become complex, but the way they think, the way they approach decisions, habits, and opportunities is shockingly simple. They simplify not because they're avoiding hard work, but because they understand that complexity is the enemy of consistent execution. They know that the more moving parts you add to your life, your business, or your goals, the more friction you create, and friction slows everything down. Their relationship with simplicity begins with how they make decisions. The average person tends to overthink, overanalyze, and overcomplicate almost every choice. They gather endless information, obsess about worst-case scenarios, and get trapped in mental loops. Billionaires cut straight through that noise. They identify the core variables that matter, ignore the rest, and make the decision. They don't chase perfection, they chase clarity. They're not afraid to be wrong because they know they can adjust later. What they avoid at all costs is getting stuck. because stuck people never build momentum. Simplicity in decision-making keeps them moving, while complexity paralyzes everyone else. This focus on simplicity also shows up in their routines. People imagine that the ultra-successful must have wildly sophisticated schedules or advanced productivity systems, but the reality is almost the opposite. Their routines are clean, repeatable, and predictable. They structure their days around a few high-quality habits that support their energy, their focus, and their long-term goals. They eliminate anything that drains mental bandwidth. They don't waste time trying to reinvent their schedule every week. The simplicity of their routines frees up enormous amounts of cognitive space that can then be used on the decisions that actually matter. They know that mental energy is finite, and anything that consumes it unnecessarily is quietly stealing from their potential. Another area where simplicity becomes a superpower is in the way they design their businesses. While most leaders try to show how much they can handle, billionaires do the opposite. They ask, how can we make this simpler? How do we remove steps, bottlenecks, and dependencies? How do we build systems that run smoothly without constant intervention? They know that a simple system is stronger than a complicated one because simplicity exposes problems immediately while complexity hides them. When something goes wrong in a simple system, you can identify the issue and fix it quickly. But in a complicated one, you get lost trying to figure out where the leak even started. Simplicity makes scaling easier, it makes growth predictable, it makes teams more efficient, it reduces waste, and above all, it allows a business to move faster than the competition. Their obsession with simplicity also shapes their personal philosophy. They understand that life becomes chaotic when you accumulate too many commitments, too many possessions, or too many unnecessary relationships. They aren't minimalists in the trendy sense, but they are minimalists in a strategic sense. They keep their inner circle small and meaningful. They choose the relationships that align with their values and let the rest fade without drama. They protect their attention by minimizing distractions. They're mindful of what they bring into their lives because they know that every new connection, possession, or responsibility adds weight, and unnecessary weight slows progress. You can also see this principle in the way they communicate. When a billionaire talks, they tend to be direct, concise, and focused. They don't use complicated language to impress people or hide uncertainty. They say what needs to be said and leave out what doesn't. This kind of communication builds trust because people always know where they stand. Clear communication creates strong leadership, clean execution, and fewer misunderstandings. They've learned that clarity beats cleverness every time. Another important aspect of their relationship with simplicity is that they constantly refine their approach. They are always looking for ways to make things smoother, faster, cleaner, and more efficient. If something requires 10 steps today, they look for a way to reduce it to 5 tomorrow and 3 the day after. They treat life like a system that can always be optimized. They don't wait for problems to appear. They search for friction before it ever becomes a problem. This constant pruning keeps their path clear and their progress steady. What's interesting is that while the wealthy embrace simplicity, most people run in the opposite direction because they mistake complexity for sophistication. They think that complicated plans make them look intelligent or hardworking. But complexity doesn't create success. It prevents it. The ultra-wealthy understand that the simplest plan executed consistently will outperform the most complicated plan executed inconsistently. They know that clarity creates confidence, and confidence fuels action. They know that simplicity sharpens focus, and focus is what turns small steps into massive outcomes. Ultimately, their devotion to simplicity is not about reducing effort, it's about maximizing power. A simple life is a powerful life. A simple strategy is a scalable strategy. A simple decision-making model is a fast one. And in a world moving at unbelievable speed, simplicity becomes a competitive advantage that compounds over time. Many people think billionaires rise because of brilliance or luck, but in reality, one of their greatest strengths is that they remove everything that doesn't matter so they can give their full energy to the few things that do. When you really step back and look at these unspoken rules, something interesting happens. You start to realize that nothing the ultra-wealthy do is mystical or locked behind some secret door. It's not coded language or hidden formulas. It's simply a different way of approaching life, choices, and time. And the more you listen to these patterns, the more you see that wealth isn't just about money. It's a byproduct of how a person thinks, how they behave, and how consistently they follow principles that most people overlook because they seem too simple, too slow, or too unglamorous. Billionaires aren't playing a different game. They're playing the same game differently. And the moment you understand that, the entire landscape of what you believe is possible begins to shift. The truth is, most people chase tactics. They want step-by-step plans, shortcuts, fast results, or some magic investment that will solve everything. But if tactics were the answer, everyone would be wealthy by now, because tactics are everywhere. You can find them in books, podcasts, blogs, and YouTube videos, yet people stay stuck because tactics don't matter without a strong internal operating system, and that's exactly what these rules shape. They form the foundation that makes every action more intentional, every decision more accurate, and every opportunity easier to recognize. Wealth is really just the outcome of having an operating system that works, and billionaires spend their lives building and refining that system. What's fascinating is that these rules aren't rigid or extreme. They don't require you to wake up at 4 a.m. or grind 18 hours a day or sacrifice every part of your life. In fact, most billionaires don't even believe in that lifestyle. What they believe in is leverage, clarity, long-term focus, simplicity, emotional steadiness, curiosity, and relationships that compound. When you combine those elements, a life begins to elevate almost automatically. You start making cleaner decisions. You stop wasting time on what doesn't matter. You build habits that pull you forward instead of constantly pushing uphill. You begin to see the world with a wider lens, noticing opportunities that were invisible when your mind was crowded with stress and noise. And here's the part people often misunderstand. These rules work even if you're nowhere near being rich. You don't need a mansion or a hedge fund or a team of advisors to adopt them. They work at every income level because they're based on how humans grow, how focus works, how confidence develops, and how momentum builds. A person earning minimum wage can use these rules to climb to the next level. A young entrepreneur can use them to build the foundation of a thriving business. A student can use them to create clarity around their future. These principles scale up as you grow, they evolve with you, and the sooner you begin implementing them, the faster your life begins to shift in subtle but powerful ways. Maybe the most important shift of all is the way you start viewing time. Billionaires see time as their most precious currency. Everything they do stems from protecting, multiplying, and maximizing the value of their minutes. When you start thinking like that, everything changes. You stop giving your time away to people who drain you. You stop saying yes to distractions. You stop tolerating tasks that don't move you forward. You start designing your life instead of reacting to it. And once you develop that mindset, your progress becomes almost inevitable because you're no longer fighting against the current, you're finally moving with intention. Another transformation that happens is in your identity. When you adopt these rules, you stop seeing yourself as someone who is trying to succeed and start seeing yourself as someone who is building success through daily choices. Identity shapes behavior. Behavior shapes results. Billionaires don't consider themselves lucky. They consider themselves responsible for the outcomes they create. And when you start thinking the same way, you begin taking ownership of your time, your habits, your mindset, and your environment. That's when real growth begins. That's when you move from hoping to becoming. When you step into this way of thinking, you also stop comparing yourself to others. Billionaires don't waste mental space worrying about what someone else has that they don't. They focus on their own path. They measure themselves against their own potential. When you embrace this mindset, your life starts to feel lighter. You stop getting distracted by social media, by other people's timelines, by false expectations. You start creating your own rhythm, your own momentum, your own definition of success. That's when clarity settles in and growth accelerates. And maybe the most beautiful part of all these rules teach you that greatness comes from consistency, not intensity. You don't need to overhaul your life in one day. You don't need to transform everything at once. You just need to start choosing differently, one decision at a time. That's how billionaires operate. They build slowly, intentionally, patiently. They know growth compounds quietly at first, then loudly later. They trust the process long before the results show up. And that's something anyone can do. So as you walk away from this, remember that none of this is out of reach. These rules aren't locked behind a vault. They're available to you right now. You can think differently starting today. You can choose differently starting today. You can simplify, focus, protect your time, deepen your curiosity, invest in relationships, and build leverage starting today. These aren't billionaire rules. They're human rules, rules for anyone who wants a life of clarity, purpose, and upward momentum. And the moment you begin living by them, your life won't just look different, it will feel different. It will feel aligned, intentional, and powerful in a way that makes you realize you were capable of this all along.